for us to get finished and we'll conclude our study on marriage and divorce. This is, in my estimation, the singular principle that needs to be kept in mind as we think about this matter. As we've been going through this, it's, I guess maybe 6 or 7 weeks now, we have repeatedly, when we have questions, we always come back to the matter of the oneness principle. And in just about every case, the oneness principle answers the question at hand. And the matter of the oneness principle is the essence of marriage, that God takes two and makes them one. That's the way it was from the very beginning in the garden in Genesis chapter 2, verses 23 and 24. It's the text that Jesus himself repeated in Matthew 19, verses 4 and 5, then added these words, "What God has joined together, let not man put asunder." We've looked at ways, the only 2 ways by which the oneness principle can be severed. Obviously, the first is by death, which the Bible teaches in Romans 7, 1-4, and in other 1 Corinthians 7 as well. And then by means of fornication on the part of one of the mates, one of the spouses. And that's Matthew 19 and verse number 9. Now I would add, and we said this all the way back at the beginning, that fornication on the part of one of the mates does not necessarily, in any way, necessarily sever the union. That fornication only permits the putting away and remarriage on the part of the innocent party. It does not demand it. And I think it would go without saying that in every case, if at all possible, God would want 2 people to be reconciled without divorce. But He does give this as a means of permission in Matthew 19 and verse 9. So the oneness principle on the part of the innocent party is severed in the case of divorce for the cause of fornication. Now I want to look at 3 things that were either on the other board that we had up here, things that were mentioned, and for some reason we just lost our connection. I want to look at 3 things, and the first is can you remarry your spouse? Now there would be a number of I guess we might say contingencies here. The reason I mention this, obviously, is 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verses 10 and 11, which says that the wife is not to depart from the husband, or the husband from the wife, and that but if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. So in that particular case, if you have 2 people that divorce for whatever reason, the Bible, I guess we'd say, hopes that they would be reconciled, or the Bible instructs them to be reconciled. And really, if you have a divorce for reasons other than fornication, then the Bible demands reconciliation if there's going to be a second marriage. And so, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. We'll call this in the event of a non-Matthew 19:9 divorce. Okay? Now, what about if you have a Matthew 19:9 divorce? What if a person puts away their spouse for fornication, and now they're no longer married? Can those be remarried? reconcile? Well, of course they can. There's nothing that permits this couple from remarrying. In the event of the guilty party still can only be married to who? The original spouse. But the innocent party is free to be remarried to anybody, right? Obviously, that has the freedom to be married. And so, if you have a Matthew 19:9 divorce, you still have the ability to be reconciled. And I think that's what the Lord would want. He'd want people to be reconciled if at all possible. The reason I mention this is that when I was in Arizona, the position of the eldership in that congregation was not a position of truth on the matter of divorce and remarriage. And they basically took the divorce, repent, and remarry position. And that we talked about last week and week before. And in a discussion with one of the elders about that matter, he cited Deuteronomy 24. Now let's go ahead and look there real quick. In Deuteronomy 24, now there's an added factor in the equation here in Deuteronomy 24. There's an added factor. It says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and she finds no favor in his eyes because he's found some uncleanness in her, he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. When she goes, or has departed from his house and goes and become another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then the former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been, and the text says, defiled. And so you have a situation where a man divorces his wife, and we'll do it this way. And then she goes off and takes husband, we'll call it number 2. Now the text in Deuteronomy 24 says, if this husband divorces her or he dies, she cannot go back to her first husband. And he made that argument because I was talking about the need for reconciliation. Now, the problem with his argument was he was trying to use an Old Testament text to teach something or teach in the New Testament era or the New Testament dispensation. Now, if a man divorces his wife for fornication, all right, we're going to call this a Matthew 19:9 divorce. And she goes and she marries somebody else. But that doesn't work out. And the second husband divorces her. Can the first husband take her back? Can the first husband take her back? See the wheels turning, Woodard? What's the answer?
I think so, yeah.
I think you're right. I think you're right. Why? Because of the oneness principle. Because of the oneness principle. There was never a oneness principle involved in this marriage. If he put his wife away for fornication, he can be remarried, or he can be married again to essentially anybody, right? And so the fact that she might go off and marry a second husband and that doesn't work out, I don't think means that they can't be reconciled down the road because of the oneness principle. Now, granted, that doesn't happen a lot. All right? But the possibilities would still be present. And the point I wanted to make is that the oneness principle helps us answer this question. Okay? Now, I was trying to think if there's anything else I had written down on this one. I don't see I don't see anything, but I brought that up because that became a point of contention for me in my work in Arizona. It ultimately led to me. Basically, I had to get out and as we say, come back to God's country and come back to the South. But the idea of invoking Deuteronomy 24 as a prescription not to reconcile to me was very problematic in view of 1 Corinthians 7 and verses 10 and 11. All right.
Again, what the man divorces his wife for fornication, whatever, and he marries another lady. Okay, and he decides to take his wife back.
First wife back?
Yeah.
Won't work.
Can that
Won't work. Why? Why won't it work? Did you hear what he asked?
Yeah.
He says, here's we'll call him husband one and wife one, and he puts her away for fornication, Matthew 19:9. And he marries what we'll call wife number 2. But he decides he wants his first wife back. Decides he likes his first wife better than he does his second wife.
It's called the oneness principle for a reason.
It's called the oneness principle for a reason. Because is the oneness principle invoked or involved in this marriage?
Yeah.
It is. So if he puts this wife away for any reason other than fornication, he's stuck. He's stuck. In other words, he becomes as if he was her, right? He becomes as if he. And I'm glad you brought that up for me, because I was thinking about that earlier today, and that was the one contingency that left me when I was trying to think of what I had written
I
down.
was thinking more about the wife, second.
Sir?
I was thinking more about the second one. Did she
No, the second wife is the oneness principles involved here. If he puts his first wife away for fornication, he's free to remarry anybody that obviously has the scriptural right to marry. And if wife number 2 meets that description, the oneness principle is invoked here as if there was never a first marriage. The oneness principle applies here.
But if he goes back to wife 1, and no, I'm not saying, wait till I finish. If he cheats with wife 1, then she's free. Because
Wait a minute. At what point are you starting this what if? What point does the ifing start?
I didn't say that what if.
Yeah, but you've got this man somewhere. You're starting with this man, right?
That man right there is in a covenant relationship with that woman too.
Right.
Alright, but if he commits fornication,
Right.
alright, that would put him in the Matthew 19:9. She would be free
This wife would be free.
to do what she wants. I think that might have been what he was looking at. Is that what you was looking at, Furman, about life?
Now he was talking about this one going back to this one after.
That one went back to that one, and it was
Look, if this husband cheats on his second wife, he's stuck.
yeah.
And the only person he can ever be married to the rest of his life is this one right here.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Therefore, the oneness principle now can be invoked by wife 2.
Correct. It is invoked by wife too. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. The oneness principle. Look, when you get to the oneness principle is the great clarifier.
Todd, if you need a TA up there, you just tell
I
me.
need a TA. Yeah, I need a TA. All right. Now, second thing I had on my list that I wanted to look at, and this was on the board. This is the matter of annulment. See, I hung Walter on this one early on. I trapped him. Because he had one idea of annulment, and I invoked another idea of annulment. Now, what is an annulment? By description.
When they do it now.
Yeah, what is an annulment? No, just in general, what is an annulment?
Say you got some kids and they get married, you don't think they're old enough or didn't get permission or whatever, you can carry them and get an annulment.
All right, you hear that? You got 2 kids that run off and get married. Let's just say for the sake of argument, they're 15 years old. All right, they're 15 years old, and you got 2 kids, and they run off and they get married, and they're 15 years old. All right, now, what's the law in the state of Alabama? Thank you, Alexi. You can't do that. You can't do that by the laws of the state of Alabama, because the state of Alabama, I think, says that you have to be. Yeah, but how old do you have to be without a parent's permission in Alabama? Is it 18? I was thinking it was 18. So this number could be anywhere. This number could even be 17.
It's 16, actually.
It's 16.
Yep.
You can marry at 16.
With parental consent, 16, 17.
All right, with parental
So you
consent,
have to say-
16 or
So you
17.
have to say 18 without consent, 16.
18 without consent. All right, so here we are. We're either 15 to 17, which means if you're 14, you can't get married off. See, anywhere from 15 to 17 years old, they run off and they get married. All right, now, they run off and get married. Now, by the laws of the state of Alabama, that is not a binding covenant, because it doesn't meet the criteria of the law, and because the state says a person has to be of some age in order to enter into a binding contract. So let's just say first of all that they lied about their age. They said they went and they said they were 18. Maybe they even got some kind of documentation that said they were 18. Maybe they got some kind of an ID card or something that says they were 18. But for whatever reason, they lied about their age and entered into this marriage by fraud. That's right, by fraud. Then you would have, as opposed to having a divorce, you would have an annulment, because a divorce would recognize a marriage. An annulment simply says that something transpired that was not legal, was not on the up and up, and therefore it just simply dissolves it. In other words, there wouldn't be an ex-wife, there wouldn't be an ex-husband, there wouldn't be alimony involved, there wouldn't be personal support involved. And so the concept of annulment is a valid concept. Now, how far you would want to carry this would be of some discussion.
They used to go to Mississippi.
People used to go to Mississippi.
They accepted Mississippi.
Go to Fulton, because you could get married in Fulton.
You didn't have to have a blood test, what it was.
Yeah, but whatever the reason was, a marriage that involves people that are not of legal age to enter into that marriage would require an annulment. All right. Now, and by the way, the state might issue an annulment.
Got another question though. Where do you go into the Bible to find that, to disagree with annulment, however it works? I mean,
There's nothing in the Bible with regard to annulment.
that's what I thought. I couldn't find it.
There's nothing. But what do we say? What do we say about marriage? Generally speaking, what do we say is required to meet the requirements of marriage? It's got to be in accordance with the laws of God and the laws of man.
You also have to have some.
Sir, you have to have some measure of standing. That's right.
Like baptism.
Right.
You need to understand what you're doing before you do
Right.
it.
What are you going to say, Walter?
That's all right.
The Bible does not speak of annulment. Right? The matter of annulment is a legal matter that involves people that don't, and the legal term is standing. They don't have standing to enter into that agreement. Let me ask one more question. Let me throw one more thing out, and that is the matter of, what if somebody married under false pretenses? In other words, what if one of the parties presented themselves as something that they really were not? For example, what if a woman presented herself as never having been married and she'd been married 5 times? To me, I would think the same thing. That if a person entered into a marriage that was entered into under false pretenses, there would be a degree of fraud involved, of misrepresentation, and in that case, I think annulment applies in this case as well. Now, what are you gonna say, Dana? I was actually hoping you'd forget, but.
Adults that are of legal age that have married have been given annulments as long as they didn't consummate the marriage.
Now that, you know what? I had not thought about that. Right? Now, that brings us into another question. Does there have to be consummation of marriage in order for a marriage to be valid?
Absolutely not.
And the answer to that question is, Colby's right. The answer to that question is no. The answer to that question is no. And the reason I'll tell you that is, when Rhonda and I married, on the day we married, we got married at like 12:30 in the afternoon, something like that, all right, on a Saturday. Well, my best friend from high school and college got married the same day, in the same church, and we wore the same tuxedos. He was in my wedding at 12:30. I was in his wedding at 6, and he and I were the same size, and almost all of our groomsmen were the same. And so, because we were the same size, all he and I did was switch coats, because my coat had tails on it, and everybody else's coat was short. So I got married with the coat with tails at 12:30. We swapped coats that afternoon, and he got married in the same coat I did at 6 o'clock. All right? Now, as soon as they said I do in that wedding and they walked out, I came down and got Rhonda and we left. We didn't wait on nobody else. All right? But the point is this. We got married at 12:30. All right? We didn't get to Newport, Arkansas until 9 o'clock that night. Were we married at 12:30 or not?
Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%.
We were 100% married. If I had a life insurance policy that paid to my next of kin or my nearest of kin, and we had a car wreck on the way to Newport, Arkansas, who's going to get that money? Rhonda is. We're married.
But is that not man's law and not God's law yet?
What do you mean?
Between the two.
No, the idea of consummation as a requirement is the idea of man. It's never the idea of God. It's not in the Bible. It's not in the Bible. Because in Bible times, eunuchs got married. Eunuchs got married. Now, you know what a eunuch is, right? I mean, we don't need to go into detail about that, do we? Now, if a eunuch can marry, he's married, right? And so this idea that Rhonda and I weren't really married until we got to Newport, Arkansas is just patently false. I mean, we're married.
What if that was a law of land?
What do you mean, the law of land?
I mean, if they'll allow it to be an annulment
Because the law, well, now with regard to insurance policies or whatever, then you'd have to fight that as a law of man. But as far as the law of God's concerned, we were married from the moment everything transpired at 12:30, we were married.
So at that point, we're not worried about the law of man.
That's right. That's right.
You make your vows before God.
That's right.
So therefore, once you do that, that's it.
So, but did you bring that question up? Who brought up the consummation question? Was that you, Dana? That was a good question, Dana, because that's a good question, because some people think that you can get an annulment, on that basis, and it's like you never got married, but that's not true. Catholic Church grants annulments for a lot of different reasons.
That is one.
All right, and the establishment, I mean, I'll just tell you straightforward. The establishment of the Church of England was based on the fact that Henry VIII could not get an annulment from his wife. The Pope would not grant him an annulment from a woman who had been his wife for years But he wanted to divorce her and marry, I believe it was Catherine of Aragon.
It was.
All right? And so, because he couldn't get an annulment from his wife, he just disregarded the Pope and started his own church, the Church of England. And instead of having the Pope, you had the Archbishop of Canterbury was the head of the church. Which, by the way, that move led to the death of tens of thousands of people over the next 200 years. Based on who was sitting on the throne in England, if they were a Catholic or if they were an Anglican, led to the deaths of thousands and thousands of people. There were wars fought over that matter. All because one guy couldn't get an annulment from the Pope. So they grant all kinds of annulments. If you've got enough money, you can get an annulment in the Catholic Church. I mean, that's just the way that it is. But I wanted to bring up the idea of annulment. By the way, if two people just got slobbering drunk and met one another in Las Vegas and got married, and neither one of them could remember, you'd have to get an annulment.
Yeah.
Right? Why?
Neither of them were in correct statement.
That's right. So annulments are a valid means of dissolving a marriage or dissolving a wedding ceremony. All right. Now, any more questions about annulments? All right. By the way, annulments would also be helpful when you deal with like Muslims with child brides. There were 10,000 men in Iran last year that took brides that were 9 years old or younger. All right. Now they were polygamous. A lot of them were polygamous. Some of them were not. But the point of the matter is, you can't marry a 9-year-old. All right. And anybody can see through a ladder ought to know that. But nevertheless, that's one of their practices.
All right, what of a man married a man in his oneness principle? You can't never get divorced, nothing.
There it is. The oneness principle. All right. Now here's one I'd never heard before until 2 or 3 years ago. I've been preaching for going on 30 years. I've never heard this in my whole life. And that is this. That if a couple is married and one of them cheats on the other, if the innocent party forgives the guilty party, that frees them to remarry. The innocent party can divorce the guilty party, forgive them, and which allows the guilty party to remarry. Never heard that in my whole life. Like I said, you have one of them points where you think, I thought I've heard it all. I thought I'd heard it all. I listed 15 or 16 points about contentions on divorce and remarriage, and that was number 17 because I thought I'd heard it all until I heard that. Now, well, yeah, that's missing. Yeah. My question is, what does Matthew 19:9 teach us? Whoever divorces his wife, except to be for fornication, marries another, commits adultery, and he who marries her who is divorced commits adultery, unless her husband forgives her. Yeah, there's the second half. I thought I'd go ahead and quote it for you, Sean. I knew that's where you're going with that. I've never heard that in my whole life. Never heard that in my whole life. But I heard it now. I mean, look, the answer to that is still Matthew 19:9.
They could say they forgive you, but they can't live with you.
Yeah, I forgive you, but I can't live with you.
Yes.
So I'm going to divorce you, but I'm going to forgive you, and then now you can go get married. That way it takes the guilt off the innocent party as if, well, I don't want to feel like I'm holding too much control over you, so I'm going to release you.
That's completely irrational.
It is, but I like I said, I've never heard it, but it's taught. The last thing is this. This goes to the matter of qualifications for elders. This is not necessarily a divorce and remarriage question, But it is a question about marriage, and I think it's one that needs to be at least looked at a little bit. What does one wife mean in 1 Timothy 3:2? If a man desires the office of an overseer, he desires a good work. First, an overseer must be blameless, comma, the husband of one wife. What does that statement mean? And by the way, there is no consensus on what that statement means. There is no consensus. I'll just tell you, what I've always been, I'll get to you, Lynn. Give me just a second. I won't forget you, I promise. I've always been taught that phrase means he has to be a married man. That's what I've always been taught. That the phrase "the husband of one wife" means that he has to be a married man. Well, see, and that's
Not just has to have a wife, it's one wife, and I think it refers back to the original wife, the oneness principle.
look. The more I've studied it, the more I think you're right. Now, wait a minute. Well, we're not saying anything about the marriage situation. We're always assuming that the man is scripturally married, whether he's remarried for Matthew 19:9 reasons or Romans 7 reasons. Hold on a second. I promised Lynn I'd get to him. All right, Lynn.
I had a fellow was telling me one time that this talking about this, elder being married to one wife.
Mm-hmm.
He said that meant one at a time. In other words, he could have been married. I told him, I said, in other words, he could have been married 3 times, but just so he wasn't a polygamist, he'd be all right. He said, yeah.
Now that is a common view. Now, obviously there's a problem with that view. First of all, what the New Testament teaches about marriage, right? But I don't think in any way that the phrase "husband of one wife" is an admonition against polygamy. I don't think that text has anything whatsoever to do with polygamy on a number of reasons. Number one, Jews were not practicing polygamy in the first century. The Romans did not permit polygamy in the first century. The law of Rome did not permit polygamy. Right? The law of Christ did not permit polygamy. Right? I mean, Matthew 19:4-6. For this cause shall a man leave father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. All right? So the very principles of marriage tell us from the Old and New Testament that this text is not talking about polygamy. Right? Not only that, there is not one admonition anywhere in the New Testament that forbids polygamy or speaks about a man who is practicing polygamy. So the point is that polygamy in that part of the world was done. It wasn't being practiced by anybody. So I don't think the one wife means that he just has one at a time so far as polygamy is concerned. And I don't think, obviously, it's one at a time that a man could have, been married a half a dozen times.
Talking about like he's been married, divorced,
Mm-hmm.
divorced.
Right.
As long as he's had one.
Right. And by the way, that's listen. That's not an uncommon view.
I've never heard of that before. I told him I've never heard of that.
I've heard it. Walter.
I wondered if a man was a elder and his wife died, then he'd have to get out of eldership.
Now here's what.
It says that's the principle to get in there. You got to be the husband of one wife.
Okay.
Or if she dies, you're not the husband of one wife.
Right. It depends on how you're going to apply the phrase "husband of one wife." Does it mean that you're a married man, or does it mean that you've only been married to one woman? And that's what you were getting at, right, Dana? And that it means one woman, that a man would. I think obviously the man would have to be married at the time of his appointment.
Oh yeah.
At the time of his appointment.
what I was saying is,
I know what you're saying.
I would think they need to move on.
Well, there are cases.
You mean if an
If
elder's wife died,
Yeah.
he needs to step down?
Yeah.
Some
Now,
elders have stepped down.
I've seen it both ways. I've seen men step down from the eldership because their wife died. I've seen men not step down at the death of their wife because they were the husband of one wife at the time of their appointment. And so and the reason I mention that, there is zero consensus as to what. Now, Wayne Jackson, who's a pretty good Bible student, but he's not infallible. Wayne Jackson, and you can find this on Christian Courier. You can go to ChristianCourier.com and just type in the search bar "husband of one wife," and there's probably a number of articles that he's written along those lines. Jackson takes the position that it means he must be a married man, but if his wife dies, he has to step down because he no longer meets the qualification of being a married man, and that's
That's kind of where
and that's what Walter
That still don't explain the one.
right. But sometimes the number is just simply a matter of emphasis and not a matter of specificity, I guess.
What would be the point of it? I mean, why would you,
Yeah.
just say the husband of the wife?
And see, and
He would have a wife.
right now, there's another text in 1 Timothy, in chapter 5 and verse 9, when it speaks about the church taking in widows into the number. Now, there are a number of qualifications that are there. One of them is she has to be at least 60 years old. And but the second is having been the wife of one husband. Having been the wife of one husband. And as a general rule, everybody that I know and have read on 1 Timothy 5:9 says one means one. And so if Paul wrote 1 Timothy 5 and said having been the wife of one husband, then why wouldn't we understand the same when the same phrase is used, but the roles are reversed? The husband of one wife. And the more I read it, the more I tend to that point, that if a man's wife dies, then
And it may be because of the stability of a marriage relationship, a long marriage, or, not someone that was married for just 10 years and now they're with another wife.
see, but there's too much, we can't presume anything so far as intent. Why did God intend to do this? When you start talking about why God intended to do a certain thing, then you're stepping into the area of presumption. You're right, we have to go.
Intended one wife.
Right, he always intended one wife. But he permitted, if a woman dies, for a man to marry again, or put away a spouse for a man or a woman, either way, to be married again. And so I can do some more digging on this if you want me to spend some time on it. But there is no consensus on that matter. And by the way, you can take the one wife position, as Dana and I were discussing it, with just having been married one time, that if a man is the husband of one wife and his wife dies, he would still meet the criteria because he's only been married one time. So you can take the one wife position and end up with two different views on what happens if she dies. You see? That he would have to resign, or he doesn't have to resign because he still meets the qualification of having had one wife.
Okay, what if she dies and he leaves eldership?
And marries again, then I still think the one wife principle, if you're going to be consistent, and that's like I said, there's some difficulties involved there. If his wife dies and then he remarries, he's got a wife. He's got one wife. Now let me. There's one thing I wrote down that I wanted to mention. with regard to this discussion, and also, but it usually applies to elders and deacons. Look, there is no such thing as a man with two living wives. We've used that terminology for years and years. He has two living wives. There ain't one thing in the Bible that ever says about a man having two living wives unless he's what? A polygamist. If he's a polygamist, he has two living wives.
Unless he lives over the Old Testament.
He can have one living wife and be living in adultery, but he don't have two living wives. You know why? Oneness principle. Yeah, Dwayne. What? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The man be a polygamist have two living or 700 living wives. But a lot of times we use the terminology. We use the terminology now that a man let's say a man has divorced his wife for fornication and he's remarried, and somebody might oppose him from being a deacon because he's been married before. And they say, well, he's got two living wives. No, he don't. He has one wife. And he has a woman that used to be his wife that he put away for fornication, but he didn't have two living wives. However, the husband of one wife is also a qualification for the deacon. And so you have whatever it means in 1 Timothy 3:2, it means on down in verses 8 and following with regard to deacons. And so, I think the marriage requirement is first and foremost. I think it teaches a marriage requirement. But there, look, I must have read 10 different commentaries on that one phrase, and there was like three. There's basically three. The positions that I've set forth, those three positions, are evenly divided among all those 10. And I think if I probably read 10 more, I'd probably find. But that's 10. That's 10. That's from our brotherhood. Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, multi-denominational commentaries. Collective groups. There's no consensus on what one wife means, except for the fact that he has to be married.
Just a little different, but you're talking about elders. You slip that in there. He's got to have believing children.
Mm-hmm.
What about the deacon?
Says has to have children. Yeah, the adjective is not present.
Here's my way of question.
Oh, great! Thanks a lot. Oh, Kobe, we're out of time. No, go on at 6:30.
Listen, I'm not my mom. Okay, do not shut me out. So it says one wife. What if, let's say that a deacon or an elder divorces his wife, but then remarries said same wife.
It still goes back to what is your view of what does one wife mean?
Let's take the one wife.
You're right. You're right. That's why I'm telling you. There's no consensus on the matter. Look, there's no difference. Look, there's not a lick of difference in a man whose wife dies and he remarries, and a man who puts his wife away for fornication and remarries. Those two men are in the exact same position. I mean, they're married, and they are married in the eyes of God with God's blessing. But how that relates to 1 Timothy 3:2 is a different matter altogether.
Well, since they weren't practicing polygamy at the time, that kind of strikes that.
I know. Listen,
back to the one.
the more I study it, Dana, the more I'm leaving the position that I always grew up believing and leaning toward only married one time. For whatever reason, death or whatever. All right. Anything else? All right. My phone says 6:30. I don't know if this thing's been running half the time. It's probably just as well.